When the general turned emperor, Marcus Aemilius Aemilianus, ascended to the throne in mid-253, he did the natural thing and provided a rich bonus to the legions, despite the poor fiscal health of the empire. Far from a selfless gesture of generosity, however, Aemilian was doing the only thing he could to safeguard his regime in an era of unprecedented instability that had seen emperor after emperor die by violent means, and had made him the fourth Augustus in just 5 years. Hoping to buck this trend, as his very life depended on it, Aemilian made the legions swear a decade-long oath of loyalty upon receipt of the donative, with the assurance that a new donative would be made with the renewal of the oath every 10 years. But the fates would not be so kind to Aemilian. He was not destined for a celebrated decades-long reign that could steer Rome out of its cycle of ruin. Instead, he had only about a month left to live. Aemilianus was little distinguished by birth, and less distinguished by his reign, in the 3rd month of which he was cut off. This ignoble end, and the obscurity as a mere footnote in the histories that is associated with it, was the result of a military rebellion and civil war, meaning that the very methods which brought Aemilian to the throne would be his undoing. Like many emperors of the chaotic 3rd century, he aimed to break a cycle of imperial weakness by fomenting a civil war, either unaware or unbothered by the fact that this would ultimately weaken the empire and leave it vulnerable to outside threats and further internal revolt. After years of setbacks on the Danube frontier, including the humiliating death of the Emperor Decius at the hands of the Gothic king Cniva in 251, Aemilian, as the military governor of Moesia, scored a significant victory against a group of Goths that had broken their treaty with Rome and ransacked areas of Greece and Asia Minor once thought safe from the barbarian menace. But Aemilian had done more than simply intercept the raiders. He had crossed into Gothic territory to lead a punitive expedition against those who had broken faith. At a time when Roman pride was at an all-time low, this critical victory convinced many that the empire's flagging fortunes may be on the cusp of revival. Aemilian's triumph over the Goths should have been the empire's salvation, and had the political infrastructure of the mid-3rd century been as robust as that of the High Republican era, then the victories of a subordinate would have represented no threat to his superiors. Now, however, there was only one possible outcome. Aemilian was acclaimed emperor by his troops, as he had proven that he had the ability to succeed in protecting the frontier, in contrast to the failure of the sitting Emperor Gallus, who had been forced to make a humbling peace with Cniva in the wake of defeat at Arbritus in 251. In an era of one-man rule and lifetime tenure at the top, the only way for a more qualified candidate, or someone who at least felt they were more qualified, to ascend to the highest position was over the corpse of his predecessor. In the bygone days of the Republic, a praetor could openly boast of his military victories, and even receive a triumph because the sitting consuls knew that his future success did not pose a danger to them. In fact, they may even start to woo the upstart if his victories were so convincing as to make his election to the consulship a foregone conclusion. This was the benefit of a system that rewarded generals for their abilities and their ambitions. But in the empire, peaceful change was impossible, meaning that violent change was inevitable. If you're enjoying this video, please do us a favor by liking, commenting, and subscribing. We're a small channel, and this is the only way to get the almighty YouTube algorithm to notice us. Furthermore, you can help Tribunate become more sustainable by becoming a member for as little as 99 cents a month. Thank you for all of your support. Unlike the last rebellion by Decius in 249, who had supposedly had the imperial claim thrust upon him by power-hungry troops, Aemilian seems to have planned his rebellion from the start, doing all he could to earn the undying loyalty of his troops, as well as those stationed throughout the Danube region, as part of a ploy to win them over to his side so that they could be enlisted in his campaign against Gallus. Understanding that there was no need to appeal to Rome's civilian population to win high office, Aemilian placated those with swords, by allowing his legions to keep all of the booty that the Goths had recently plundered from the empire. No effort at restitution was made for the citizen inhabitants of the wealthy cities that had been ransacked by the Goths. Their possessions and treasures were now property of the Danube legions, as if they had been the ones to lead the invasion themselves. The only saving grace was that the Roman captives were returned, but the legions could hardly be expected to hold citizens as slaves, and besides, they now had plenty of Goths to sell on the open market to further pad their growing bank balances. Believing that loyalty to Aemilian was the path to continued riches through access to the imperial treasury, all the Danube legions, including those beyond his direct control, proclaimed him emperor. He thought that he too might be able to achieve fame and fortune, so he seized the rule in Moesia, and, taking all the soldiers he could gather, began to plunder cities and people. In the next few months, while an armed host was being gathered against him, he wrought no small harm to the state. As Jordanes states, it was another civil war that Rome could ill afford, and the bloodshed among Romans becomes all the more tragic when we realize that this unnecessary conflict was occurring as Shapur ravaged the east. Instead of reinforcing the army tasked with protecting Syria, the legions of the Rhine and Danube were being drawn into conflict with one another. This was doubly damaging because not only was this battle, no matter the outcome, set to result in thousands of dead Romans, but drawing forces off their frontier garrisons invited additional incursions by the tribes. Aemilian's efforts to end the cycle of instability in reality only offered a microcosm of all the pitfalls facing Rome, as its system of government and economy, as well as the ruling class ideology that undergirded it, drifted further and further from material reality. Compare the selfish ambition of Aemilian with what occurred 300 years earlier during the Republican era, when even Julius Caesar, who was obviously not above waging war on his countrymen, prioritized the defense of Rome from outsiders against military threats posed by internal foes. In 47, Caesar put the ongoing civil war with the remnants of the Pompeian faction on hold to defeat an incursion by Pharnaces II and the army of Pontus as it advanced on Roman holdings in Asia Minor. Caesar had moved his army to confront the threat at Zela, and though victorious in a lightning campaign, it had still given his foes the time they needed to regroup. Caesar's conception of legitimacy was consistent with Republican ideology, and derived from popular approval, but also the ability to fulfill the constitutional responsibilities of the magistrates, chiefly to protect the Republic and its holdings. So Caesar had given his opponents much-needed breathing space, knowing that as the dominant power in the East, had he failed to rise to the occasion, then the optimates who painted him as a power-hungry tyrant who cared little for Rome or its people would have been proven right. To Caesar, then, it was a natural choice to destroy the foreign threat before settling scores with his fellow Romans. But by the 3rd century, this line of thinking had disappeared entirely. There was now no real ideological or civic underpinning for the legitimacy of any claimant. The only thing that determined the right to rule was possessing the strength needed to rule, derived from the support of the legions. The whittling down of all societal stakeholders, save the army, in determining who would rule helps explain why anyone seeking the throne sought first and foremost to gain the backing of the legions, a task that proved exponentially simpler as the death of a shared ideology further eroded any rationale that the troops themselves had for aligning behind any particular claimant, except his ability to win victories and line their pockets with gold. Two things that were now intimately intertwined, as the example of Aemilian and his subsequent acclamation clearly show. That this habit of acclamation by the legions was a key driver of instability and further civil war during Rome's prolonged period of crisis is well known, and we should not be so arrogant as to assume that we moderns are alone in our ability to perceive it. The Romans themselves were aware that they were caught in a deadly feedback loop. They were simply unable to break it. Each general who rose in rebellion imagined himself as the one who would break the cycle, and not as a continuer of it. ambition, and a conception of their own inherent greatness resulted in a series of men who were convinced that they were able to rise above historical forces and bend reality to their will. Despite whatever arrogant self-conception he entertained when he set out for Rome, Aemilian was not to be remembered as a world historical figure who restored order in a flailing empire. Instead, if he even is remembered, it is as only one in a shameful string of failed emperors who thought themselves above the forces of history. Men who identified the problems created by internal uprisings, but felt that a civil war that placed them on the throne was justified because they alone possessed the transcendent genius and impeccable leadership necessary to successfully navigate the storm that had been the undoing of so many others. Each believed he was above history and the forces that guided it, but all they did was serve as unwitting agents for the continued triumph of history over the conceits of man. Confident in his destiny as a great man of history, Aemilian moved rapidly into Italy, falling upon the Roman heartland before Gallus's reinforcements, in the form of the battle-hardened Rhine legions, commanded by the capable General Valerian, were able to arrive. He collected all the forces of that country, who were become more bold since his successes against the barbarians, and directed his march towards Italy, with the design of fighting Gallus, who was as yet unprepared to contend with him, for Gallus had never heard of what had occurred in the east, and therefore made only what accidental preparations were in his reach, while Valerianus went to bring the Celtic and German legions. But Aemilianus advanced with great speed into Italy, and the armies were very near to each other, when the soldiers of Gallus, reflecting that his force was much inferior to the enemy, both in number and strength, and likewise that he was a negligent, indolent man, put him and his son to death, and, going over to the party of Aemilianus, appeared to establish his authority. On this day, Aemilian must have counted himself the most fortunate Roman, for this latest victory had come with virtually no bloodshed, save Gallus and those closest to him. The Roman army was still intact. Now all he had to do was patch things up with the Senate, and a glorious reign was assured. We can almost forgive him the optimism of the aforementioned 10-year oath he now ordered the legions to swear. To win over the impotent aristocrats of the Senate, Aemilian offered them the one thing they coveted above all: actual power. In a letter to the Senate after his victory, he pledged to divide authority with them, proposing to leave civil administration to the Senate, but to personally take charge of military affairs as Rome's permanent leading general. While this may have been a much-needed effort at reform, it's also possible that the offer was a ruse to ensure the Senate posed no roadblocks to his ascension by potentially aligning with Valerian, who was still on the march to Italy and had not bent the knee to Aemilian, despite the death of Gallus. Unfortunately, his brief reign leaves us unsure what his actual designs were, but we do know that the effort was successful, and the Senate sided with Aemilian over Valerian, despite the fact that Valerian claimed he was fighting to avenge Gallus, who he considered the legitimate emperor. Aemilian's bliss at his easy victory surely faded fast, as Valerian himself soon appeared in Italy. Though declared an enemy of the state by the Senate, he possessed the larger army, and refused to acknowledge Aemilian's claim. After all, why should he? The new emperor had no dynastic link to boast of, and could not claim any unique standing that Valerian did not also possess. The only thing that differentiated Aemilian from the bulk of the Roman populace was that he had thousands of soldiers loyal to him. But Valerian had even more. Surely, even a brute like Aemilian could now see the irony of his predicament. He was being unmade by the same circumstances that only recently won him the throne. An ambitious regional commander felt he could do a better job, and was now intent on claiming his head. But Aemilianus, in his 4th month, was defeated near Spoletum, or a bridge which is said to have taken its name from the destruction of the Sanguinari, between Ocriculum and Narnia, positioned in the middle of the area between Spoletum and the city of Rome. Aemilian was slain by his own troops in September of 253, a bitter reenactment of the fate that had so recently befallen Gallus, only a month earlier. By one count, it had been just 88 days since he was acclaimed emperor, and he enjoyed sole authority for only a few weeks. It is frequently mentioned that during this crisis, the average reign of a Roman emperor was a scant few years, and that was for the ones that were luckier than Aemilian. The takeaway here being that instability at the top had pernicious effects that reverberated throughout the empire, and that the constant change prevented any one holistic vision for reform from being enacted before a successor assumed power, and undid whatever meager progress had been made in the pursuit of their own agenda. However, it is my belief that the problem cannot be attributed to the brevity of the reigns alone, for it was not the brief time each sovereign spent at the top which led to the disorder, but rather the method by which they were deposed which invariably plunged the Roman world into chaos. During the Republican era, the consuls had been successful not in spite of their short one-year term in office, but because of it. Combined with the fact that the collegial nature of the position increased access, each consul possessed their office with the assent of the Roman people, granting them legitimacy, something even their political rivals could acknowledge, as it was always possible for a defeated candidate to try again. This wide buy-in from the populace enhanced the prestige of the consuls and allowed each to act with authority. Furthermore, the high turnover meant that if one proved incompetent, he was soon on his way out the door. There was no need to wage war to depose him and extinguish his line. Of course, the Republic was not without its flaws. It, too, was riven by contradictions that caused the ideological superstructure to drift from the actual conditions and productive forces that animated it. But while in the end the Republic had cannibalized itself after achieving hegemony, the empire of the 3rd century was being carved up by foreign foes as it lost its grip on all the hard-won gains of the past. The new Emperor Valerian certainly believed that he would be the one to deliver Rome from its trials and tribulations. But the fate which awaited him was the most horrific for any emperor in history, and his downfall would represent a true low point for an empire teetering on the brink of collapse.